The county courthouse sat like an old sentinel at the heart of the small Midwestern town, its red brick walls weathered from decades of storms, protests, and verdicts that shaped the community's fate. On that particular morning, however, the building seemed to breathe heavier than usual, as if it knew that the trial inside would carry a weight far beyond its ordinary docket of property disputes and minor assaults. People had lined up early outside the courthouse doors, curious neighbors, reporters with notepads, and a few activists with signs demanding fair justice. The whispers began before anyone even stepped through the metal detectors. "That's him, Michael Dawson," someone murmured, gesturing toward a tall, tired-looking man walking up the steps with his attorney. Dawson's hands were shoved into his pockets, his shoulders hunched forward, but even the posture of a weary man couldn't hide the nervous energy rippling off him. Michael Dawson, 32 years old, was not a stranger to this town. He had grown up here, worked here, and was raising his family here. To some, he was simply another face in the grocery store aisle, a man who fixed cars at the local garage and waved politely when he saw you at the gas station. To others, he was the defendant in a headline-making case, accused of trafficking narcotics, charges that could send him away for decades and leave his wife and toddler daughter to fend for themselves. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. The jury box, still empty in the early morning, looked like a stage waiting for its actors. The press benches filled quickly, reporters adjusting their recorders and laptops, ready to capture every dramatic twist. At the defense table, Dawson sat quietly beside his lawyer, Martin Hall, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. Hale had earned a reputation as someone who didn't rattle easily, a trait Dawson desperately needed in a lawyer. Across the aisle, the prosecution team prepared their opening notes. Assistant District Attorney Claire Monroe was leading the case, a woman known for her relentless pursuit of convictions and her sharp, methodical arguments. Her star piece of evidence was not a human witness at all, but a German shepherd named Rex, a decorated police dog whose nose, according to her, was beyond reproach. When the bailiff called the court to order, the judge entered with his black robe, flowing like a shadow across the polished floor. Judge Harold Whitman had presided over countless cases, but even his steady expression betrayed a hint of anticipation. This was no ordinary trial, and the courthouse knew it. The charges were read aloud: possession of narcotics with intent to distribute. The words rang heavy in the air. Dawson swallowed hard, but kept his eyes down. His wife, Emily, sat in the gallery holding their daughter on her lap, her hands gripping the child a little too tightly, as though afraid the system might steal her family away before her very eyes. Prosecutor Monroe began her opening statement with conviction. She painted Dawson as a man hiding behind the mask of an ordinary father, claiming he used his garage business as a cover to move drugs. Her tone was calm yet sharp, like the edge of a blade. Then she leaned on her strongest point. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not relying on rumor or speculation. We have evidence a trained police dog, Rex, who alerted on Mr. Dawson's vehicle. This dog's record is impeccable. He has never failed. His nose does not lie." The jurors nodded slightly, some crossing their arms, others scribbling notes. Dogs, after all, were creatures people instinctively trusted. A dog didn't lie, didn't scheme, at least not in the way humans did. Monroe knew this, and she used it with precision. When it was Hale's turn, he rose slowly, walking in front of the jury with measured steps. His voice was calm, even gentle. "You're going to hear a lot in the coming days about trust," he began. "The prosecution will tell you to trust a dog. But let's remember, dogs can be trained, guided, even manipulated, intentionally or not. What matters is not blind trust, but evidence. Hard evidence." He paused, letting his words sink in. and you'll see that this so-called evidence is anything but reliable." Dawson sat quietly, his fingers clasped tightly together. His heart pounded in rhythm with each word. He knew he was innocent, but innocence didn't always guarantee freedom. The system was complicated, sometimes brutal, and often tilted in favor of those with power. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, judging, doubting, hoping for a scandal or redemption story. As the first witnesses were called, the trial settled into its rhythm. Police officers recounted the stop, the search, and Rex's alert on Dawson's vehicle. The defense objected, cross-examined, and scribbled notes furiously. Yet through it all, Dawson's eyes drifted again and again toward his daughter in the gallery. The little girl, too young to understand the gravity of the situation, occasionally waved or giggled, a small light in the heavy air of the courtroom. The day dragged on, filled with testimony and arguments. Outside, the town buzzed with speculation, each new detail feeding conversations in diners and barbershops. Some swore Dawson was guilty. Why else would the dog alert? Others defended him passionately. He's a good man, a family man. They've got it wrong. The courthouse had become the center of the town's universe, and every whispered opinion seemed to echo within its walls. By the time court adjourned for the evening, the first chapter of the trial had set its tone. A battle between human fallibility and canine certainty, between a system that leaned heavily on tradition and a defense that dared to question it. Michael Dawson walked out of the courthouse with his lawyer at his side, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. He didn't answer. He only glanced at Emily, holding their daughter close, and whispered, "We have to hold on." And though no one in that courthouse could have guessed it, the moment that would define the entire trial was not in the evidence boxes, nor in the testimony of seasoned officers. It would come from the smallest voice in the room, a voice no one expected to matter. The trial of Michael Dawson had just begun, but already the story was writing itself into the town's history, a story of doubt, of trust, and of two words that would soon shake the very foundation of justice. The second day of trial opened with the same restless energy that had haunted the courthouse the day before. The crowd outside was even larger now, locals rubbing shoulders with reporters from regional outlets, their cameras flashing like lightning every time someone of interest approached the courthouse steps. Some carried coffee, others carried notepads, but they all carried one thing in common, a hunger for the spectacle. Inside, the bailiff's voice boomed once again. "All rise." Judge Whitman entered, his robe swaying, his expression unreadable. The jurors filed into their box, each one looking a little more seasoned than yesterday, already absorbing the weight of their civic duty. Michael Dawson sat at the defense table, quiet and pale, while his lawyer Martin Holly leafed through his binder with a deliberate calm. Across the aisle, Assistant District Attorney Claire Monroe stood tall and purposeful, her dark blazer sharp as her tone, when she announced the prosecution's next witness. "Your Honor, the state calls Officer Daniel Reynolds." All eyes shifted to the man walking forward. Reynolds was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people sit up straighter. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, and at his side sat Rex, the German shepherd whose name had already been whispered through every hallway in the building. The dog's coat gleamed under the lights, his amber eyes alert, his ears pricked forward. The jury visibly softened when they saw Rex. One juror, a middle-aged woman in a floral blouse, smiled unconsciously. Another leaned forward, his pen stilled mid-scribble. It was clear. Rex wasn't just a witness, he was a symbol, and symbols carried enormous weight. Reynolds placed his hand on the Bible, swore his oath, and then took the stand. Rex lay down obediently at his feet, tail thumping once against the floor before stilling into perfect composure. "Officer Reynolds," Monroe began, her tone respectful but firm. "How long have you served with the K-9 unit?" 17 years, ma'am, Reynolds replied, his voice steady. Rex has been my partner for 5. And how would you describe his training? Reynolds straightened. Rigorous. Rex is certified in narcotics detection, tracking, and search operations. He's been tested hundreds of times, and his accuracy rate is near perfect. The jurors scribbled notes, nodding. Some even looked at Rex as though he were more trustworthy than the humans testifying before them. Monroe saw it and pressed on. Can you tell the jury about the day you encountered Mr. Dawson? Reynolds recounted it step by step. The traffic stop, the way Rex circled Dawson's vehicle, the moment his body stiffened, and he sat down by the trunk, a trained alert that narcotics were present. His words were deliberate, rehearsed, carrying the authority of a man who had done this countless times before. Did you find drugs in the vehicle? Monroe asked. Yes, Reynolds replied. A significant quantity hidden under a false compartment. A murmur rippled through the courtroom gallery. Emily Dawson clutched her daughter tighter, shaking her head as if to will the words away. Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't look up. Monroe smiled faintly, turning to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the dog doesn't lie. Rex is trained to detect what human senses cannot. His alert led directly to the discovery of illegal substances. Without him, the drugs might still be circulating in your community. The words hung heavy in the air. The jury looked at Rex again, some nodding unconsciously. To them, the logic was simple. The dog alerted. Drugs were found, therefore Dawson must be guilty. But Martin Holley wasn't finished. When Monroe finally said, "No further questions," he rose with the calm of a man preparing to walk a tightrope. "Officer Reynolds," Holley began, his voice smooth. "You've testified that Rex is highly trained, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you'd say he's reliable?" "Absolutely." Holley took a few slow steps toward the jury box, his eyes not on Reynolds, but on the jurors. "Tell me, officer, does Rex ever make mistakes?" Reynolds frowned. "All dogs have limits, but Rex's error rate is extremely low." "Low?" Holley repeated. "But not zero?" A pause. "No, not zero." The jury shifted. Holley nodded slightly, as if he'd expected that answer. He turned back to Reynolds. "Now, when Rex alerts, what exactly does that look like?" "He stiffens, sits, sometimes scratches. These are the cues he's been trained to give. And who decides what those cues mean?" Reynolds blinked. "Well, I do. I'm his handler." "So," Holley said, his voice dropping just a little lower, "Rex's testimony is filtered through you. The jury isn't hearing directly from Rex. They're hearing your interpretation of his behavior. Correct?" Monroe shot to her feet. "Objection. Counsel is mischaracterizing the process." The judge raised a hand. "Overruled." "The witness may answer." Reynolds shifted in his chair. "I observe Rex's signals, yes. But they're clear. I've worked with him for years. I know what he means." Holley allowed a small pause, letting the tension build. Then he asked, "Officer, would it surprise you to know that Rex can respond to commands from others as well?" "Commands not from you?" The courtroom stirred. Reynolds stiffened. "He's trained to follow me, his handler. But he understands simple commands anyone might give him. Does he not? Sit, stay, find it. Those sorts of things?" Reynolds hesitated. His silence was louder than any answer. Holley turned back to the jury, spreading his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're being asked to believe is that a dog who can respond to the simplest cues from anyone should carry enough weight to determine whether a man spends decades in prison. Think carefully about that." The courtroom buzzed. Some jurors scribbled faster, others exchanged glances. Monroe looked irritated, but held her ground, waiting for her turn to redirect Dot at that moment. Rex shifted on the floor, stretching his paws forward with a yawn. as if oblivious to the storm of human drama swirling around him. Yet his mere presence was shaping the fate of the man on trial. By the end of the testimony, the jury was split between admiration and doubt. Rex was impressive, yes, but the seed had been planted. Perhaps the dog's signals weren't as infallible as they seemed. Michael Dawson exhaled slowly at the defense table, his eyes flicking to his daughter again. For now, the trial pressed on, but the cracks in the prosecution's perfect story had begun to show, and it all started with the star witness, who couldn't speak for himself. The third day of trial dawned gray and restless. Rain clouds rolled in over the small town, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps where reporters had gathered under umbrellas, their voices muffled by the steady patter of rain. A crowd outside had only grown larger, a mix of townspeople, activists, and journalists who fed daily on the trial's twists. Everyone wanted to see whether Michael Dawson, the quiet father accused of being a drug trafficker, could withstand the storm building around him. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was no less tense. The jurors filed in one by one, some weary from the relentless testimony of the previous days, others looking sharper, more attentive, as if beginning to sense that this case wasn't as simple as the prosecution wanted them to believe. Michael Dawson sat stiffly at the defense table, his hands clasped together, so tightly his knuckles were pale. He glanced at his wife Emily in the gallery, who managed a small, encouraging nod, despite the exhaustion etched into her face. Their 3-year-old daughter, oblivious to the gravity of the proceedings, clutched her stuffed rabbit and leaned sleepily against her mother's shoulder. At Dawson's side sat Martin Hawley, his defense attorney. Hawley had spent much of the previous night preparing, his hotel room littered with open files, dog training manuals, and research articles on canine testimony. His plan was bold, maybe even reckless in the eyes of traditional lawyers, but Hawley knew it was the only path forward. The state's case rested almost entirely on Rex, the German shepherd. If Hawley could unravel that trust, even slightly, he could save Dawson from prison. When the judge called the session to order, Hawley rose slowly, adjusting his tie. His voice was calm, but carried just enough weight to draw the jurors' attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "yesterday you heard from Officer Reynolds about his partner, Rex. You were told Rex is flawless, that his alerts are beyond question. But we all know perfection doesn't exist, not in people, not in systems, and not in dogs." He paused, pacing a few steps in front of the jury box. Some jurors leaned forward, others crossed their arms skeptically. Hawley welcomed both reactions. The prosecution wants you to believe Rex is not just a dog, but a scientific instrument like a microscope or a blood test. But he's not. He's a living creature with instincts, distractions, and yes, the ability to be influenced. Monroe, the prosecutor, shifted in her seat, her jaw tightening. Hawley noticed but pressed on. "You heard Officer Reynolds testify that Rex signaled drugs in Mr. Dawson's vehicle. But what you didn't hear was this. Rex responds to his handler's cues. He can be nudged, guided, even unintentionally. And when he reacts, it's Reynolds who interprets that reaction, not Rex himself. Think about that. Every so-called alert you're asked to trust is filtered through a human being with a stake in the case." He let the words sink in, his gaze moving across the faces of the jurors. A young man in the back row frowned, scribbling furiously in his notebook. An older juror tapped his pen against his chin, thoughtful. Hawley took a breath, lowering his voice into something almost conversational. "Now imagine this. You're at home, and your child, your grandchild calls out to the family dog. Sit, stay, find it. What happens? The dog obeys. Why? Because dogs are loyal, eager to please, and trained to respond to those words. Rex is no different. He may be highly trained, but he is still just that, a dog. He's not a machine. He doesn't swear an oath. He doesn't understand the stakes of this trial. He only understands commands. The courtroom stirred. A few heads nodded in the gallery. Emily's eyes welled with tears. She could feel hope flickering back to life. Monroe shot to her feet. Objection. Counsel is speculating wildly. Judge Whitman raised a hand. Sustained in part. Mr. Hallé, please stick to the evidence presented. Hallé inclined his head respectfully. Of course, Your Honor, and that's precisely my point. The evidence presented by the state hinges on an animal whose responses cannot be cross-examined, cannot be verified independently. We must question whether that is enough to decide a man's fate. He returned to his table, leaving his words to linger in the air. The prosecution tried to recover by calling additional witnesses, lab technicians, officers who handled the drugs once they were seized. But Hallé had already shifted the jury's focus. Every time someone mentioned Rex, jurors exchanged glances, as though silently asking themselves, can we really trust the dog? During cross-examinations, Hallé was surgical. He questioned chain of custody procedures, raising doubts about how the evidence was handled. He pressed officers on whether Rex had ever alerted falsely in training. He cited studies suggesting police dogs often responded more to their handlers' subconscious cues than to the actual scent of narcotics. Each question was a chisel strike, small but steady, carving away at the prosecution's stone-solid image of Rex. By midday, Monroe was visibly irritated. She objected often, but each objection only highlighted Hale's persistence and composure. The jury noticed the difference. Monroe seemed defensive. Hallé seemed methodical. When court recessed for lunch, the chatter in the hallway was electric. Reporters swarmed lawyers and townspeople alike. Is the defense saying the dog can't be trusted? One journalist asked. Are they undermining the entire K-9 program? Another pressed. In a quiet corner, Emily Dawson hugged her husband. They're listening, Michael, she whispered. I can see it in their faces. They're listening. Back in the courtroom that afternoon, Hallé continued to weave his strategy. He called a dog training expert to testify, who explained how even the best-trained K-9 South could misinterpret signals or become distracted. The expert described experiments where handlers, convinced drugs were present, unconsciously cued their dogs into false alerts. The jurors scribbled furiously again. Doubt was no longer a shadow at the edge of the case. It was standing right in the center of the room. Finally, Hallé delivered his closing for the day. He stood once more before the jury, his voice steady. This case isn't about whether dogs are wonderful companions or skilled partners. We all agree they are. This case is about whether you can send a man to prison based on a signal that no one here truly understands, except one man, the handler. If a child can command Rex, if Rex can be nudged by subconscious cues, then how reliable is his testimony? Ask yourselves, would you want your future decided by a nod, a scratch, a wag of the tail? Silence filled the courtroom. Even Rex, lying calmly at Reynolds' feet, seemed to embody the tension, his chest rising and falling with each quiet breath. The judge dismissed the jury for the day, but as they filed out, their expressions told a story no one could miss. The defense's strategy had landed. What seemed unshakable yesterday was now riddled with cracks. Michael Dawson exhaled, relief softening his shoulders for the first time in days. Emily smiled faintly, clutching their daughter. The trial was far from over, but hope, real, tangible hope, had finally entered the room. And yet, Hallé knew he had more to prove. Raising doubt was not enough. He would need something undeniable, something that would shatter the illusion of Rex's infallibility. What he didn't yet realize was that the key to that moment would come from the smallest voice in the courtroom. The fourth day of trial began with a strange heaviness, as if the very air in the courthouse carried the weight of something unspoken. Outside, the rain had cleared, leaving behind damp sidewalks and the smell of wet earth. Reporters once again clustered at the steps, their voices buzzing with speculation about the defense's strategy. The day before, Martin Hawley had planted seeds of doubt about Rex's reliability, but no one yet knew what he was building toward. Some whispered he had a trick up his sleeve. Others dismissed him as stalling for time. Inside, the courtroom was as packed as ever. The jury settled into their seats, some wearing guarded expressions, others clearly intrigued. Michael Dawson sat rigid, his eyes shadowed with worry. His wife Emily, seated in the gallery, clutched their daughter a little closer than usual. The child, dressed in a soft yellow dress with a ribbon in her hair, fidgeted with her stuffed rabbit, blissfully unaware that her presence in the courtroom might soon become far more than symbolic. The morning passed in the usual rhythm: testimonies, objections, cross-examinations, but the energy was shifting. The prosecution's witnesses seemed less convincing now that Hawley had carved holes into their certainty. The jurors no longer wrote notes with eager confidence. Instead, their pens hovered, hesitant, as if each word they committed to paper carried greater weight than before. Then, just after a heated cross-examination of a narcotics officer, Heil did something that no one expected. He rose from his chair, smoothed his tie, and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor," Hawley said, his voice calm but steady, "the defense would like to call one final witness today." Judge Whitman looked up from his notes. "Another expert, Mr. Hall?" "No, Your Honor." Hawley paused, letting the silence stretch before continuing. "We'd like to call the defendant's daughter." The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing in every corner of the room. The gallery gasped. A reporter dropped his pen. Even the bailiff blinked in surprise. Monroe shot to her feet. "Objection. Absolutely not. This is a stunt, Your Honor, and completely irrelevant to the matter at hand. A toddler cannot possibly provide competent testimony." Hawley held his ground. "Your Honor, I am not calling the child to testify on the facts of the case. I am calling her to demonstrate something crucial, something that goes directly to the reliability of the prosecution's star witness. Rex." All eyes flicked to the German shepherd, who lay calmly at Officer Reynolds' feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but watchful. The judge hesitated. He was a man not easily rattled, but this request was far from ordinary. "Mr. Howell, are you seriously suggesting we allow a 3-year-old child to perform a demonstration in my courtroom?" "Yes, Your Honor," Hawley replied firmly. "And I assure you, it will be brief, harmless, and directly relevant." Monroe's voice cut sharp through the air. "This is outrageous. He's trying to turn this into theater. The jury should not be swayed by theatrics." Hawley turned to the jury, his voice calm, edged with quiet conviction. "Theatrics? No. Truth. Sometimes truth is simple, and sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places. This demonstration will show you that Rex is not the independent, flawless witness the state claims he is." The judge leaned back, tapping his pen against the bench. He studied Hawa for a long moment, then glanced at the jury. Their faces told him everything: curiosity, intrigue, even eagerness. Finally, he sighed. "Against my better judgment, I will allow it. But, Mr. Hawley, this had better be relevant and concise." Hawley bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Emily gently guided her daughter toward the front. The little girl's small shoes tapped softly against the wooden floor, each step amplifying the tension in the room. She held her stuffed rabbit tightly, her eyes wide as she scanned the sea of strangers. The judge gave her a kind smile, softening his stern demeanor. "Sweetheart," Hawley said gently, crouching to her level, "remember how you sometimes play with Rex at home when the officers brought him by?" The girl nodded shyly, her ribbon bobbing. "Yes. Would you mind showing us a little bit of that today?" The courtroom stilled, every ear straining to catch her soft reply. Emily knelt beside her, whispering reassurance. The child nodded again, her cheeks flushed. Rex, sensing attention shifting toward him, lifted his head. His ears perked, eyes bright. Officer Reynolds stiffened, tightening his grip on the leash, but said nothing. The little girl turned toward the dog, took a tiny breath, and in the faintest voice said, "Sit, Rex." The effect was instantaneous. Rex obeyed without hesitation, dropping his haunches firmly onto the floor. A ripple of gasps swept through the room. The girl glanced at her mother, who gave her a small nod. Emboldened, she whispered again, "Find it." Rex sprang to life, his body quivering with energy as he sniffed along the benches, tail wagging, nose pressing against corners and bags as though searching for contraband that wasn't there. The leash strained in Reynolds' grip. The courtroom erupted. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed looks. Reporters scribbled frantically. And even Judge Whitman's usually stoic face betrayed shock. The implications were undeniable. The prosecution's star witness, the supposedly flawless K-9, had just demonstrated that he could be triggered by a toddler's simple commands. Reynolds flushed red, yanking Rex back under control. "He's just responding to familiar cues," he stammered, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the truth with their own eyes, unfiltered, undeniable. Hall rose, his voice firm but calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the very heart of the matter. Rex is not a machine. He is not infallible. He responds to commands, to suggestions, to voices other than his handlers. If a child can direct him, how can we trust that his so-called alert in Mr. Dawson's case was not influenced intentionally or otherwise by external cues?" Monroe objected furiously, demanding the demonstration be stricken from the record. But the jurors were already whispering among themselves, their skepticism written plainly across their faces. Emily scooped up her daughter, hugging her tightly. The girl buried her face in her mother's shoulder, unaware that her innocent play had just shaken the foundation of the trial. The judge finally banged his gavel, calling for order. But the damage could not be undone. Everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed a turning point. For the first time since the trial began, Michael Dawson allowed himself a faint smile. He looked at Hall, whose calm expression betrayed just the slightest glimmer of triumph. Their gamble had paid off. The surprising witness had spoken, not with complex testimony, but with two simple words that would echo long after the courtroom fell silent. The courtroom had witnessed countless trials over the years: assaults, thefts, even a high-profile murder case a decade earlier, but never had it experienced a moment quite like this. When the toddler's soft command sent Rex to heel, and then to find it, the entire room seemed to fall into a silence, so profound it was almost physical. It was the kind of silence that presses against the ears, that tightens the chest, that makes every creak of a wooden bench sound like thunder. People sat frozen, their eyes darting between the dog, the child, and the jury. Officer Reynolds looked as though someone had pulled the ground out from beneath him. His face flushed a deep crimson, his hand gripping Rex's leash, as though the strength of his hold might restore the dog's credibility. Rex himself appeared calm, unaware of the chaos he had just unleashed. To him, it was all a game. A familiar voice had given him a familiar order, and he had done what he was trained to do. Judge Whitman, usually unflappable, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and stared down at the bench as though words might appear there to guide him. But words failed him. In the jury box, 12 men and women sat motionless, their pens halted above notepads, their faces etched with disbelief. One juror mouthed something silently, perhaps a curse, while another leaned back slowly, as though the weight of what they had seen was pressing him into the chair. A few glanced at each other, sharing the unspoken acknowledgement. Everything we thought we knew about this case just changed. In the gallery, the atmosphere was no less electric. Reporters scribbled furiously, some with their hands trembling from adrenaline. Every camera clicked, trying to capture the innocence of the toddler still clutching her rabbit and the stark contrast of the trained police dog responding to her. The public smelled history in the making, and the air buzzed with the knowledge that this moment would not stay contained in the walls of the courthouse. Michael Dawson sat still at the defense table, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He hadn't moved since the moment his daughter gave the command. A surge of hope flooded through him, but it was tempered by fear that somehow, some way, the system would find a way to brush it aside. He clenched his jaw, eyes locked on the jurors. They were the key. He needed them to remember that moment, to feel the same shock he did, to carry it into deliberation. Emily Dawson sat in the gallery with tears running silently down her cheeks. She hugged her daughter close, whispering words of comfort, though the little girl didn't understand why her simple play had caused so much commotion. To the child, it was no different from what she had done dozens of times at home when officers had brought Rex by the house. But Emily knew better. She knew the power of what had just happened. Finally, Judge Whitman banged his gavel, though even he lacked conviction. Order. We will have order in this courtroom. The murmurs subsided, but the tension remained, thick as fog. Monroe, the prosecutor, sprang to her feet. Your Honor, this demonstration was improper. It is irrelevant, misleading, and prejudicial to the jury. I demand it be stricken from the record. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the strain. She was rattled, and everyone could see it. Hawley rose slowly, calm as ever. Your Honor, the demonstration was directly relevant. The prosecution has built its case almost entirely on Rex's supposed reliability. What we witnessed just now shows that Rex is not some infallible instrument. He is a dog one that responds to anyone's commands, including a toddler's. Monroe slammed her palm against the table. This is a circus. The defense is turning a serious matter into spectacle, but her words rang hollow. The jurors had seen the truth for themselves. No amount of objection could erase the memory of Rex obeying the little girl's voice. The judge leaned back, exhaling through his nose. He rubbed his temples, then spoke with measured words. The demonstration stands. The jury will weigh it as they see fit. Gasps echoed in the gallery. Hale's gamble had paid off. For several minutes after, the proceedings staggered forward, but the rhythm of the trial had been broken. Witnesses stumbled through their testimony. Jurors scribbled half-hearted notes, and even Monroe seemed to lose her sharp edge. The memory of Rex, following the toddler's commands, lingered like a ghost, impossible to banish. Hawley sat quietly, letting the moment work in his favor. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. He knew better than to appear triumphant. Instead, he leaned toward Dawson and whispered, "That was the turning point." Dawson nodded faintly, though his hands still trembled. He wanted to believe, but years of mistrust in the system made it hard to surrender to hope completely. The rest of the day passed in a haze of testimony and objections. But the highlight, the only thing anyone would remember, was the toddler and the dog. When the judge finally dismissed the court for the evening, the gallery erupted into noise. Reporters rushed out the doors, desperate to be the first to file stories. Spectators buzzed with disbelief, trading theories like gossip. Outside, the courthouse steps turned into a frenzy of cameras and microphones. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Hawley, was that planned? Did you rehearse it with the child?" Hawley ignored them, guiding Dawson and his family through the crowd. Emily shielded her daughter's face, unwilling to let her innocence become fodder for the evening news. Meanwhile, Monroe stormed past the cameras, refusing to answer questions. Her jaw was clenched, her eyes fixed forward. For the first time in her career, she looked less like the uncheckable prosecutor and more like someone who had just been blindsided. Back inside the nearly empty courtroom, Judge Whitman lingered at the bench, staring at the space where the child had stood. In his decades on the bench, he had seen theatrics, tricks, and passionate arguments. But this was different. This was not theater. This was raw, undeniable truth presented in its simplest form. A child had shattered the illusion of infallibility, and the courtroom would never forget it. That night, news broadcasts across the country replayed the story. Some commentators praised Hale's ingenuity. Others criticized the court for allowing such an unorthodox demonstration. But all agreed on one thing: the jury's perception of Rex, and by extension, the prosecution's case, had been irreversibly altered. In the Dawson household, the move was cautious, but hopeful. Michael tucked his daughter into bed, kissing her forehead. She yawned sleepily, asking why everyone had gasped when she told Rex to sit. Michael swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Because you are very brave," he whispered. When she drifted off to sleep, Michael and Emily sat together in silence, holding hands. For the first time since the nightmare began, they allowed themselves to imagine a future outside the shadow of prison bars. But as Hale reviewed his notes late into the night, he knew one truth: the battle was not over. The prosecution would come back stronger, more determined. They would fight to salvage Rex's credibility. And it would be up to him to ensure that the jurors never forgot the sight of a child's command unraveling the state's star witness. The courtroom had held its breath that day. The question now was, when it exhaled, would it breathe justice or conviction? The morning sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long golden bars across the polished wood floor. It might have been an ordinary day in another setting, but here, inside this chamber, time seemed to move differently. The trial had reached a threshold, one that neither prosecution nor defense could have predicted. Rex, the German shepherd who stood as the prosecution's star witness, shifted slightly in his position at Officer Reynolds' side. His coat gleamed under the lights, his ears alert but relaxed. To the jury, he had seemed unshakable until now. The room was thick with anticipation, like the air before a storm. Every eye was fixed on the little girl standing near her mother, a stuffed rabbit dangling from her small hand. Her shoes barely scuffed the floor as she stood there, nervous but resolute, the weight of hundreds of gazes pressing down on her tiny shoulders. She didn't understand the stakes. To her, it was only a game, a chance to play with a familiar dog. To everyone else, it was a test that could unravel the very foundation of the prosecution's case. Martin Hall, the defense attorney, crouched beside her, his tone calm and warm. "Do you remember what you used to say to Rex?" he asked softly. The girl nodded, her ribbon bobbing with emotion. Her voice was timid, almost swallowed by the silence. "Yes." Hall smiled reassuringly. "Go ahead, sweetheart. Just like at home." She turned to face Rex. The German shepherd's ears pricked, his eyes locked on her. The room collectively leaned forward, breaths held, as though one wrong move might shatter the fragile stillness. Then she spoke. "Sit, Rex." 2 words, instantly. As if pulled by an invisible string, Rex's body obeyed. He lowered his hindquarters smoothly to the ground, his gaze steady on the child. A wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jurors' eyes widened, pens dropped onto notepads, and someone in the gallery let out an audible, "Oh my God," but the girl wasn't finished. She took a small step closer, clutching her rabbit with one hand, while raising the other as if mimicking the officer she'd once seen. Her voice was stronger this time. "Find it." And like a switch had been flipped, Rex launched into action. His nose dropped to the ground, tail wagging as he pulled against Reynolds' grip. He sniffed along the jury box, then darted toward the benches, weaving between legs and bags, searching with the same intensity he had shown during the original drug search. The room erupted into chaos. Jurors jerked their feet back. Spectators gasped and craned their necks to see. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching like rapid fire. Flashbulbs burst from the back as cameras captured every angle of the spectacle. Reynolds struggled to contain Rex, yanking on the leash, his face flushed with panic. "Heel! Heel!" He barked, but Rex ignored him. Too consumed by the command to stop Dot, it was no use. The truth was out, laid bare before everyone. Rex was not some incorruptible instrument of justice. He was a dog, subject to suggestion, triggered by the simplest words even from a toddler. The judge's gavel slammed down repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" His voice boomed, but the frenzy was slow to die. When Reynolds finally managed to restrain Rex, dragging him back to his side, the damage was already done. The jurors had seen it. They had felt it. No amount of instruction could erase the sight of a police dog hailed as the state's strongest piece of evidence obeying the innocent command of a child. Monroe leapt to her feet, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is absurd. This proves nothing but that the animal is well trained." But even as she spoke, she knew the words rang hollow. The jury wasn't listening. Their eyes were on the little girl, who now clung to her mother's leg, confused by the uproar she had caused. Hyle stood slowly, his presence commanding the room without raising his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, turning toward them, "you have just seen with your own eyes what I have been arguing from the start. Rex is not infallible. He is not some impartial instrument of truth. He is a dog highly trained, yes, but still vulnerable to suggestion, to commands, to human influence. If a child's words can compel him, how can we trust that his so-called detection of drugs in Mr. Dawson's car was free of influence?" He let the words sink in. Silence stretched, heavy and undeniable. Across the room, Monroe slammed her binder shut. "This is a dangerous stunt. Your Honor, I renew my motion to strike the demonstration from the record." Judge Whitman's gavel came down once more, though his face betrayed unease. "Motion denied. The jury will consider what they witnessed as part of the evidence." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd again. The decision was final. The jury would carry those two words with them into deliberation. Michael Dawson sat motionless, his heart pounding. For the first time since his arrest, he felt a spark of hope too powerful to ignore. His daughter's voice, two simple words, had done what months of legal maneuvering could not. It had cracked the prosecution's case wide open. Emily hugged her daughter close, pressing her lips to the child's hair. The girl whispered, "Did I do good, Mommy?" Emily's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "You did perfect, baby. Perfect." Outside the courthouse, word spread like wildfire. By the time court adjourned for the day, the story was already being broadcast on news networks across the nation. "Toddler commands police dog in court," the headlines read. Footage replayed endlessly. The child's soft voice, Rex's obedient sit, and the explosive reaction that followed. Commentators debated fiercely. Some called it the most extraordinary courtroom moment of the decade. Others criticized the defense for exploiting a child. But beneath the noise, the question remained. If a toddler could control Rex, how reliable was the state's case? That night, jurors lay awake, replaying the scene in their minds. Some tried to rationalize it, perhaps it meant nothing, but the image refused to fade. The defense hadn't merely cast doubt. They had delivered a spectacle of truth too striking to ignore. For Hawley, it was the gamble of his career, and it had paid off. But he knew the fight wasn't over. Monroe would regroup, clawing for any angle to salvage her case. Yet no matter what she did, she could never erase what the jury had witnessed with their own eyes. 2 words had changed everything. 2 words from the smallest voice in the room had shaken the foundation of justice. And now, as the trial barreled toward its conclusion, the outcome no longer felt inevitable. The jury's faith in Rex was gone, and with it, the prosecution's strongest weapon had crumbled. The courtroom still buzzed from the shock of the toddler's command, but when the gavel fell a final time, and Judge Whitman announced a short recess, the energy shifted. People rose from the benches in hushed conversations, their voices hushed but urgent, as though afraid to disturb the fragile silence lingering after what they had seen. The jury remained seated for a moment longer, frozen in their box. They were 12 ordinary citizens who had expected a straightforward trial, one like the kind they saw on television or read about in newspapers. Yet here they were, having just watched a police dog, the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, obey the whispered commands of a 3-year-old child. Juror number 3, a middle-aged accountant named Thomas Keller, pinched the bridge of his nose and exhaled slowly. What the hell just happened? He thought. He had taken copious notes throughout the trial, recording the details of Officer Reynolds' testimony and the prosecution's arguments. But now, those notes felt meaningless, like numbers from a ledger that no longer balanced. Beside him, juror number 7, a retired teacher named Barbara Mills, stared wide-eyed at the defense table. She had taught children for 30 years, had heard countless tiny voices echoing in classrooms, playgrounds, and lunchrooms. That same small, unassuming voice had just shattered her confidence in the evidence. She whispered under her breath, "A baby did that." The foreman, juror number 1, rubbed his chin, clearly unsettled. He tried to keep his face neutral, but the weight of his role pressed heavily now. His responsibility was to guide discussion, to maintain order when deliberations began. But what order could exist after a moment like this? He scribbled in the margin of his notepad, "Dog responds to anyone gives reliability?" Across the room, Prosecutor Monroe stood stiff, her jaw locked as she packed her papers with unnecessary force. She knew she had to regroup quickly, to reframe what had just happened before the jury allowed doubt to fester into certainty. Every second that passed without her voice, controlling the narrative, was a second Hale's demonstration worked its way deeper into the jurors' minds. Officer Reynolds avoided everyone's gaze, his face crimson. He tightened his grip on Rex's leash, though the German shepherd was now calm again, tongue lolling as if proud of his obedience. Reynolds' career, built on the reliability of canine testimony, suddenly felt fragile, as though the floor beneath him had cracked open. Meanwhile, Martin Howell sat quietly at the defense table, his hands folded. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. He knew better than to appear smug. This was no time to celebrate. This was the time to let silence do its work. The jurors had seen the truth, and he trusted them to carry it in their hearts. He simply leaned toward Michael Dawson and whispered, "Stay steady. We're closer now than we've ever been." Michael nodded faintly, though his throat tightened with emotion. For the first time in months, hope felt tangible. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was the spark of possibility. He glanced at his daughter, now safely back in Emily's arms, and whispered a silent thank you. The judge left the bench, retreating to his chambers, but not without a final look at the jury. He knew they were rattled. He knew this case had taken a turn that would be studied by law students for years to come. His gavel had restored order, but order didn't erase memory. And memory was what jurors carried into deliberation. During the recess, jurors were escorted to their private lounge. They weren't supposed to discuss the case until deliberation, but the air was thick with unspoken words. They sat in uneasy silence, exchanging glances that betrayed their turmoil. Keller tapped his pen against his notepad. He wanted to speak, to break the silence, but he knew the rules. Instead, he flipped back to his notes, staring at the bold words he had written earlier. Rex detected drugs gives strong evidence. He drew a single line through the phrase, the ink scratching like an erasure of certainty. Barbara Mills folded her arms across her chest, staring at the ceiling. She replayed the child's tiny voice in her mind. It haunted her, not because it was frightening, but because it was so innocent. If such innocence could sway Rex, how much influence had Reynolds unknowingly or intentionally exerted? The foreman cleared his throat quietly, reminding them all with a glance, not yet. But even he couldn't stop the wheels from turning. Back in the courtroom, Monroe approached the bench with urgency. "Your Honor," she hissed, careful to keep her voice low. "We cannot allow that display to overshadow the facts. I move again to strike it from the record. The jury will draw unreasonable conclusions." Whitman's expression was stern, weary. "Miss Monroe, I denied your motion once. You'll have to rebuild your case on substance, not suppression." Her lips tightened into a thin line. She wanted to argue, but she saw the futility. Instead, she returned to her seat, fury radiating from her posture. She would adapt. She had to. Her reputation, perhaps even her career, hung in the balance. Hawley said nothing. He didn't need to. Every moment of Monroe's frustration only reinforced his silent victory. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The judge reminded them of their duty, his voice measured and calm, but the reminder felt hollow. They had already witnessed the unexplainable. They had already absorbed the image that would guide their deliberation. The rest of the afternoon dragged with testimonies from technical experts and lab analysts, but their words seemed muted, muffled by the memory of Rex snapping to attention at a toddler's command. The jurors listened politely, but their eyes lacked the spark of engagement they had shown earlier in the trial. One by one, the prosecution's witnesses seemed smaller, less convincing. Even Monroe's once commanding voice carried a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. Her objections were sharper, her tone brittle. The jurors noticed. Jurors always noticed. Meanwhile, Hawley moved deliberately, asking few questions, raising few objections. He let the silence work, let the memory fester. It was as though he had placed a single stone in a pond, and now he was watching the ripples spread dot by the time the judge adjourned for the day. The jury's shock had not faded. It had deepened. They left the courtroom with furrowed brows, distant gazes, and notes filled with question marks. That evening, the jurors dispersed to their separate hotels, forbidden from discussing the case. But each carried the same unshakable thought. If a toddler can control Rex, can we trust anything he did? Outside, the courthouse steps became a frenzy once again. Reporters shoved microphones at anyone connected to the case. "Is the trial over now?" One shouted. "Will the charges be dropped?" Another demanded. Emily shielded her daughter's face as she and Michael slipped quietly into the night. Hawley, trailed by reporters, offered no comment. His silence was as deliberate as his strategy. Inside his chambers, Judge Whitman poured himself a glass of water and sat heavily in his chair. He rubbed his temples, whispering to himself, 2 words. 2 damn words. He knew what history would say, that this was the trial where a child toppled the credibility of a police dog. He wondered how the justice system would recover from the precedent. And in hotel rooms across the city, 12 jurors lay awake in the dark, each haunted by the same image, the same sound, the same truth. The toddler had spoken, the dog had obeyed, and nothing about the case would ever be the same. When court reconvened the next morning, the atmosphere was markedly different. The grandeur of the room, with its polished oak walls and high, arched windows, seemed diminished under the weight of what had transpired. The air itself felt charged, as though the walls had absorbed the shock of the previous day's demonstration, and now exhaled unease with every breath of the people inside. The jury filed in silently, their faces drawn. Some avoided looking at the prosecution's table altogether, while others cast quick, furtive glances at Rex, who sat beside Officer Reynolds, calm and unbothered, as if he had not shattered the trial only a day before. To him, nothing had changed. But to everyone else, everything had. Judge Whitman, who had spent a restless night replaying the toddler's 2 words in his mind, addressed the courtroom in his steady, measured tone. Ladies and gentlemen, we continue today with the understanding that this trial remains about facts, evidence, and truth. I remind you to consider all testimony presented fairly and impartially. But his words, though formal, sounded hollow. The jurors had already glimpsed truth in its rawest form, and no admonition could erase it. The prosecution tried to recover, parading forensic analysts and lab technicians to reaffirm that drugs had, in fact, been found in Michael Dawson's car. But their voices lacked conviction, their charts and chemical results paling in comparison to the visceral memory of Rex obeying a toddler. The jury scribbled fewer notes, their faces blank, but inwardly skeptical. Monroe fought valiantly, her questions sharp, her objections constant. Yet every word she uttered carried a defensive edge, as though she were patching a ship already taking on water. She emphasized procedure, training, and certification. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it had grown into something undeniable. When Halley rose for his closing arguments, he didn't raise his voice or pound the lectern. He spoke softly, deliberately, trusting silence to draw the jurors closer. "You have seen the prosecution's star witness," he said, gesturing toward Rex, "not Officer Reynolds, not the lab reports. The dog. Rex was presented to you as flawless, incorruptible, infallible. You were told to believe that his actions alone were enough to strip a man of his freedom, to condemn him as guilty. But then you saw something extraordinary. A child barely tall enough to reach this lectern spoke 2 words, and Rex obeyed. Not because he smelled drugs, not because he detected danger, but because someone told him to. That's not justice. That's not certainty. That's doubt, plain and undeniable." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And our justice system does not convict on doubt. It cannot, because if it does, none of us are safe." The courtroom was silent, but alive with energy. The jurors leaned in, absorbing every syllable. Halley sat down, his expression calm, though his heart pounded beneath his suit. He knew he had given them everything. Now it was up to them. The deliberations stretched into the night. 12 jurors sat around a wooden table, their notes spread before them. The foreman opened the discussion with a solemn reminder. "We decide a man's fate tonight. We must be certain." At first, some clung to the prosecution's evidence, the drugs found in the car, the procedures followed. But one by one, others pushed back. "How do we know the search wasn't influenced?" Barbara Mills asked, her voice steady. "If a child could command Rex, what's to say Reynolds didn't cue him, even unintentionally?" Thomas Keller added, "The foundation of the case was Rex. Everything else flowed from that. And now? That foundation looks cracked." They went back and forth, weighing facts, replaying testimony. But no matter where the conversation began, it always circled back to the same moment. The toddler, the 2 words, the obedient dog. By dawn, they had reached a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. Michael Dawson sat rigid at the defense table, his wife's trembling hand in his. Halley stared straight ahead, masking his nerves behind the calm exterior that had carried him through the trial. The foreman stood, a folded slip of paper in his hand. His voice carried across the room, steady but heavy with the gravity of the decision. "On the charge of drug trafficking, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The words hung in the air for a beat before the gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, Even muffled cries of relief filled the space. Michael slumped forward, his hands covering his face, as Emily sobbed quietly beside him. Hawley placed a steadying hand on his client's back, his lips pressed into a faint but triumphant line. Monroe sat motionless, her jaw clenched, her eyes fixed on the papers before her. She had lost not just the case, but the aura of invincibility that had long surrounded her courtroom presence. Reynolds bowed his head, one hand resting on Rex's collar. For the first time, he looked not like a proud canine handler, but like a man carrying the weight of a broken system. Judge Whitman thanked the jury, his voice tinged with fatigue. "You have served justice faithfully," he said. But in his heart, he knew this trial would echo far beyond his courtroom. In the weeks that followed, the case dominated headlines. Legal analysts debated whether Hale's demonstration had been fair, ethical, or even appropriate. Civil rights advocates hailed it as a landmark moment, exposing the fragility of canine evidence. Police unions defended the use of canine units, insisting that one courtroom stunt did not erase decades of reliable service. Talk shows replayed the footage endlessly, the child's soft command, Rex's obedient sit, the courtroom's collective gasp. It became a symbol, a meme, even a late-night punchline. Yet beneath the noise, real questions lingered about justice, about evidence, and about the thin line between truth and illusion in America's courts. For Michael Dawson, the verdict meant freedom. He returned home with his family, determined to rebuild his life. But he carried scars of fear, of uncertainty, of the system that had nearly swallowed him whole. He knew how close he had come to losing everything, and he knew others might not be as fortunate. For Emily, the moment her daughter commanded Rex remained seared into memory. She replayed it often, marveling at how innocence had cut through the machinery of power. And for their little girl, life quickly returned to normal. She played with her toys, asked for bedtime stories, and laughed freely, unaware that her tiny voice had changed the course of her father's life, and perhaps the justice system itself. Late one evening, Hale sat in his office, the city skyline glowing through the window. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. On his desk lay stacks of case files, but his mind drifted back to that moment in court, the child's words, the dog's obedience, the jury's shock. He had gambled everything on that demonstration, and it had worked. But what haunted him wasn't victory. It was the realization that justice had come not through careful evidence or skilled cross-examination, but through the innocence of a child, exposing a flaw everyone else had ignored. He raised his glass in a quiet toast, not to himself, but to the fragile, unpredictable nature of truth. 2 words, he murmured. 2 words changed everything. And across the country, those 2 words continued to echo in courtrooms, in classrooms, in living rooms, forcing America to ask itself just how much trust it could place in a wagging tail and a bark.